Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to deconstruct a story that, well, it seems to break all the conventional rules.
So, how do you even begin to tell a story like that? We're looking at Donald Trump, a figure who just seems to defy any normal kind of analysis. And to really get it, we've got to look at the very rules he seems to love to break. And to do that, we're actually going to use the art of storytelling itself as our guide. It's kind of like we're using a rulebook for writers to understand someone who's famous for not following the rules. We'll deconstruct his journey, his strategies, and yeah, all the controversies that define his public image.
Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. We'll look at the character arc, the playbook he uses, how he takes control of the story, all those unanswered questions, and finally, we'll try to figure out how you can even conclude a story like this one.
All right, first up, the character arc. You know, every classic story is supposed to have three parts, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end. So to really get a handle on this character, let's just start with a simple timeline.
So you can see the journey here. From a real estate heir in Queens, he becomes this massive tycoon, and then, boom, reality TV stardom with The Apprentice. I mean, his path to the presidency was anything but traditional. He wins in 2016, then loses in 2020, and then makes history with a second non-consecutive term in 2024. This is not your typical political story arc. It's really a media-driven journey, and that sets the stage for a very unique kind of protagonist.
Okay, now let's get into the playbook. Storytelling 101 says you've got to cover the who, what, when, where, how, and why. So let's use that framework. Let's start with the who and the how to really see what makes this character tick. Just who is he and how does he operate?
So, who is he? Well, political psychologists actually have a name for this style. They call it high dominance charismatic. It's basically a mix of being super ambitious, outgoing, and, well, dominant. But the key thing, his real asset, is mobilization. That's his uncanny ability to get people fired up, engaged, and pointed in the direction he wants.
And how does he do it? This is the core of his communication strategy. It's a playbook built on a few key things: super simple, memorable slogans, influencing the media directly, managing scandals basically on the fly, and of course, massive engagement on social media. It's all part of a really strategic approach to building and managing his brand.
I mean, think about this one. Make America Great Again. This slogan from 2016 is the perfect example of that messaging strategy in action. It's simple, it's emotionally charged, it's memorable, and it manages to pack a ton of complex ideas into just 4 simple words. It's brilliant, really.
And that leads us to one of his most effective tactics, something called de-intermediation. It's a fancy word, but it just means cutting out the middleman. He saw the power of speaking directly to a huge audience, completely bypassing the traditional media gatekeepers. For him, social media wasn't just a tool, it was his own personal broadcast network. It gave him total control over his own story.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. One of the first rules of investigative writing is, you don't use I. You're supposed to stay objective, stay out of the story. But Trump's whole strategy? It's to do the exact opposite. He shatters this rule by making himself the central narrator of everything.
Just look at this comparison. The old model, right? A news source talks to a reporter who then filters it for the public. But in Trump's model, he is the source. He goes straight to the public through social media. There's no filter. By becoming the main character and narrator of his own story, he gets to set the agenda. It's a direct, unfiltered narrative and a massive break from how politics usually works.
Another big rule in storytelling is you don't leave your audience hanging. You're supposed to answer the questions. But a huge part of this narrative is built around doing the exact opposite, leaving conflicts unresolved and questions just lingering in the air.
Let's start with the Georgia RICO case. This is a big one. He and 18 others are facing charges under this powerful law called RICO. And you usually hear about RICO being used to go after organized crime, like the mob. The allegation here is that they acted like a criminal enterprise to try and unlawfully overturn the 2020 election results in Georgia.
And this right here, this quote is at the absolute heart of the case against him. It's from a recorded phone call where he asked Georgia's Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes. That one sentence is what kicked off this whole massive investigation, and it's still essential and very much unresolved part of the story.
All right, now let's turn to another major area of unanswered questions: his long and well-documented association with the late Jeffrey Epstein. Obviously, this relationship has become a source of incredible public scrutiny and, frankly, a lot of speculation.
And what's really wild here are Trump's own words, way back in 2002. He said Epstein was a lot of fun to be with, and then added this part. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. So he's acknowledging right there on the record Epstein's preference for younger women.
This is where we see a huge contradiction in the story. Before the 2025 election, he was repeatedly promising to declassify and release all of the Epstein files. But then, after he's back in office, his own Justice Department announces that no client list even exists, and Trump himself starts calling the whole thing a boring issue. That's a pretty dramatic turnaround, and it definitely raised a lot of questions.
So the story is just incomplete. Sure, public pressure forced a partial release of some documents, but they were heavily redacted, blacked out. Names, key details, all gone. And there's still more than 1 million files that remain completely unreleased. The central questions are still just hanging there, unanswered.
Which brings us to the conclusion, or the lack of one. How do you possibly wrap up a story that's so full of broken rules and unanswered questions? I mean, how do you put a neat ending on a narrative that's still being written, right now, as we speak?
The guide we've been using this whole time, The Rules of Investigative Writing, has one last piece of advice. And it's a good one. It says, essentially, to break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. In other words, know the rules, but know when breaking them serves a higher purpose.
And that's really the key here. The Trump narrative is this living, breathing story. It's a masterclass in brand building, media control, and the strategic breaking of rules. We've seen how he defines his own story by shattering those rules. By rejecting objectivity, he becomes the only narrator you hear from. By leaving big questions unanswered, he keeps everyone talking, keeps them engaged. These aren't bugs in his narrative, they're the features. It's what's created this incredibly powerful and resilient brand.
So that leaves us with one last big question. In a story that's still being written, what comes next? Because this is one story that doesn't have a neat the end. Its final chapters are still unwritten, and the narrative just keeps evolving. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.